The air at the Henderson Farm auction tasted of rust and regret. It was late March 1972, that awkward time in Iowa when the ground is a cold, muddy soup, and the sky can't decide between spitting snow or a weak, watery sunlight. I stood near the back of the crowd, my hands shoved deep in the pockets of my canvas work coat, the collar turned up against a wind that had a mean streak. I wasn't there for the big-ticket items. My farm, the 320 acres my father had broken his back over, was paid for. My equipment, old as it was mine. I was a man who hated the feeling of a banker's pen hovering over my signature. I was there for parts, for the small things, a set of cultivators for my Farm M, maybe a decent wagon if it went cheap. Then they rolled it out. An Oliver 1855 diesel with the over-under hydrol shift. It wasn't pristine, the green paint faded to the color of old moss on the north side of a barn, but you could tell it had been cared for. The tires were decent, the tin was straight, and when the auctioneer's kid fired it up, the Waukesha engine settled into a deep, even-throated rumble that spoke of good compression and clean oil. It was a real tractor, built of iron and sweat. A voice, slick and loud, cut through the crowd's murmur. Well, look what they dragged out of the museum. Probably still got horsehair stuck in the radiator. I didn't have to turn around. I knew that voice. Dale Peterson. Dale had inherited the section of land bordering my west fence 5 years ago. His father, a man much like my own, had run a tight, respectable operation. But Dale wasn't his father. Dale was new money, or rather, new debt. He was the first in Black Hawk County to buy a brand-new International Harvester 1466, a monster with a turbocharged engine, a closed cab with air conditioning, and a radio that was always tuned to some rock station from Waterloo. He farmed from a different world, a world of banknotes and depreciation schedules. He sauntered up beside me, a smug grin plastered on his face. He was younger than me by 10 years, but he carried himself like he'd already conquered the world. Thinking of upgrading, Art? That old 4020 of yours must be getting tired. I kept my eyes on the Oliver. That 4020 will start when it's 20 below and will still be running when that shiny red toy of yours is a pile of parts in the dealer's yard. And it's paid for. Dale chuckled, a condescending sound that grated on my nerves. Paid for doesn't get the crop in the ground faster, old man. I planted my corn in 4 days last spring. How long did it take you with that 2-legged plow you pull? He meant my John Deere 494, a 4-row planter. It was slow, but it was accurate, and I could fix anything on it with a crescent wrench and a hammer. It took me a week, I said, my voice low and flat. And at the end of that week, I slept soundly because I didn't owe a dime to anyone for the privilege of putting my own seed in my own dirt. The auctioneer started his chant, the price on the Oliver climbing slowly. A few old-timers were bidding, men who knew what they were looking at. Dale shook his head, looking at me with a kind of pity I didn't want or need. You don't get it, Art. This is the new age. You got to spend money to make money. Leverage. The bank is practically giving away money right now. Nixon took us off the gold standard, grain prices are going to the moon, Russia's buying everything we can grow. You're sitting on a gold mine and trying to dig it out with a teaspoon. He gestured toward the line of his own equipment, parked ostentatiously at the edge of the sale. A brand new 7700 John Deere combine, so big it looked like it could swallow my whole farm. A new 24-foot disc, all of it gleaming, none of it his. It all belonged to the First National Bank of Cedar Falls. That Oliver, he said, nodding toward the auction block, is a relic. Just like your way of thinking. It's over. The bidding stalled at $2,800. A fair price. The tractor sold to a farmer from the next county over. I watched him climb up onto the seat. A proud look on his face. He knew he'd bought a decade of honest work for less than the down payment on one of Dale's new machines. I turned to leave, the taste of the auction turning sour in my mouth. Dale clapped a hand on my shoulder. No hard feelings, Art. Just trying to give you some friendly advice. The world's moving forward. You should try and keep up. I shrugged his hand off and walked back to my pickup, an old '65 Ford with more rust than paint. As I drove the gravel road home, the bare trees lining the lane like skeletal fingers against the grey sky, His words echoed in my head. The world's moving forward. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was a dinosaur. But as I pulled into my yard and saw my 4020 sitting there, solid and dependable, its faded green paint like the uniform of a trusted old soldier, I felt a deep sense of peace. That tractor had been bought and paid for with the profits from the sweat of my own brow in 1968. Every nut, every bolt, every grease zerk was intimately familiar to me. I knew its sounds, its smells, the particular way the synchro range shifter clicked into 8th gear. It was more than a machine, it was a partner. My shop was my sanctuary. A single 60-watt bulb hung from a cord in the center, casting long shadows over the workbench. The air was thick with the smell of old oil, welding flux, and damp earth. This was where I kept the world at bay. This was where I made things right again. Dale could have his dealership mechanics and their fancy diagnostic tools. I had a set of craftsman wrenches my father gave me, and a deep-seated belief that a man ought to be able to fix what he owned. Before we go any further, I have to ask you folks listening to this a question, and I want you to be honest. Back in those days, the early 70s, when the money was flowing and the future looked as wide and open as a freshly plowed field, which side were you on? Were you the guy like me with a paid-for 4020 in the shed, cautious and wary of debt? Or were you the one taking a chance, signing the papers on that brand-new 1466 with the bank's money, believing the good times would never end? Let me know in the comments below. It tells me a lot about a man, and it sets the stage for everything that came next. The following spring, my caution was put to the test. It was a wet one, the fields taking forever to dry out enough to work. I was halfway through dissing the North 80 when I felt it. A slight hesitation in the hydraulics of the 4020, a groan when I lifted the disc at the end of a pass. It was a sound I'd never heard before, a deep internal sickness in the machine's guts. I finished the row, my gut tightening with each turn of the wheels. At the fence line, I tried to lift the disc again, and this time the arms barely shuddered. The hydraulic pump was gone. Dale Peterson, working the field across the road with his 1466 and a massive 24-foot field cultivator, slowed as he passed. He sat high up in his air-conditioned cab, looking down at me like a king from his castle. He gave me a little wave, that same condescending smirk on his face, and then opened up the throttle. The turbo on that IH screamed like a banshee, and he tore off down the field, leaving a cloud of black smoke and perfectly tilled earth in his wake. He'd be done with his whole farm before I could even get my tractor back to the shop. I unhitched the disc right there in the field and limped the 4020 home. The silence in the machine shed felt heavy, accusatory. This was exactly what Dale had talked about. Downtime, lost money. While he was making progress, I was facing a greasy, complicated surgery. Fixing the main hydraulic pump on a 4020 is no small task. It's buried deep inside the transmission case, right under the driver's seat. First, I had to drain nearly 15 gallons of high-guard fluid, the thick amber liquid gurgling into a galvanized tub. Then came the heavy lifting. The rockshaft housing, a solid chunk of cast iron that held the 3-point hitch arms and weighed a good 300 pounds, had to come off. I hooked up the chain hoist to a beam in the rafters, wrapped a heavy chain around the housing, and carefully, painstakingly winched it up and away. With the housing off, I could finally see it. The heart of the beast, a complex world of gears, valves, and pistons. The main pump, a radial piston pump, was tucked away in the front. Getting it out required patience and a specific set of tools. I spent the better part of a day hunched over the open cavity of the tractor, my hands covered in grease, my knuckles scraped and bleeding from wrestling with bolts in tight spaces. Finally, with a grunt and a curse, the pump came free. It was just as I'd feared. The pistons were scored, and metal shavings had contaminated the entire system. It wasn't a simple repair, it was a full-blown rebuild. I laid the parts out on a clean rag on my workbench, each piece a testament to thousands of hours of hard work. I knew every gear, every seal, but knowing them and finding replacements were two different things. The local John Deere dealership quoted me a price for a new pump that made my blood run cold. It was more than I'd made in the last 3 months. The parts manager, a young kid who looked like he'd never had grease under his fingernails, suggested I just trade the 4020 in. "We can get you into a new 4430 with a cab and air, Mr. Miller. Easy financing." I just shook my head and walked out. The talk started at the Co-op coffee shop the next morning. I could feel the eyes on me as I walked in to get a hydraulic filter. "Heard Art's 4020 finally gave up the ghost," one voice mumbled. "Should have seen it coming. Dale Peterson's already got his beans in." Another chimed in. "A man can't farm with antiques. He's penny wise and pound foolish." They didn't understand. It wasn't about being cheap. It was about independence. It was about not being beholden to a monthly payment that didn't care if it rained for a month straight or if the price of corn fell through the floor. I spent the next 2 days on the phone, calling every salvage yard from Des Moines to Minneapolis. Finally, I found a yard in southern Minnesota that had a 4020 they were parting out. The pump was still in it, and they said it looked good. I drove the 5 hours up there in my Ford, paid the man $200 cash, a fraction of the cost of a new one, and hauled the greasy 50-pound piece of iron home in a burlap sack. The rebuild took another 3 days of meticulous work, cleaning every passage, replacing every O-ring, checking every tolerance with a feeler gauge. I worked late into the night, the single bulb in my shop casting a lonely circle of light. Outside, a spring thunderstorm rolled in, the rain drumming on the tin roof. It was rain I needed, but it was also a clock ticking, washing away the precious few days I had to get my crop in. Across the road, Dale's fields were already showing the faint green haze of emerging corn. Finally, it was done. I lowered the rock shaft housing back into place, torqued the bolts down in the correct sequence, and spent an hour refilling the transmission with fresh, clean high guard. With a prayer to whatever saints watch over stubborn farmers, I climbed onto the seat, turned the key, and pushed the starter button. The diesel engine coughed to life, settling into its familiar, comforting rhythm. I moved the hydraulic lever, the 3-point arms rose, smooth and strong, without a single groan or hesitation. A wave of relief so powerful it almost made me dizzy washed over me. I had done it. I had faced the breakdown, ignored the scorn of my neighbors, and wrestled my iron partner back to life with my own 2 hands. I was 2 weeks behind schedule, but I was still in the fight. As I drove back out to the North 80 to hook onto the disc, the sun broke through the clouds. The air was clean and fresh after the rain, and from across the fence line I could hear the faint, tinny sound of the rock music playing from the radio in Dale Peterson's tractor cab. He was already cultivating. He was winning, and everyone in the county knew it. The next few years were a blur of hard work and rising fortunes, just not for me. Not on the surface anyway. The mid-70s were the boom years. Grain prices, fueled by massive sales to the Soviet Union, shot through the roof. Corn went from $1.50 a bushel to over $3. Land that had sold for $500 an acre was suddenly being appraised at $2,000, then $3,000. The mantra from the universities and the farm magazines was "get big or get out," and the banks were more than happy to help. Dale Peterson became the local poster boy for the new era of farming. He was a genius, a visionary. He used his equity in his rapidly appreciating land to borrow more, buying up any parcel that came for sale. First, he bought the 80 acres to his south when Old Man Henderson retired. The next year, he bought the quarter section to the north. He went from farming 1 section to farming nearly 2. His equipment line grew with his acreage. The 1466 was traded for a brand new International 1586 with all the bells and whistles. The 7700 combine was replaced by the new 7720 turbo, a behemoth that could chew through 8 rows of corn at a time. He built a massive new machine shed, a gleaming monument of steel that dwarfed my old wooden barn. He put up 2 new grain bins with a modern leg and dryer system. Every time you drove past his place, there was a new piece of equipment in the yard, the paint still so fresh it hurt your eyes. And all of it, every last bolt and bushel of capacity, was financed. Dale was a regular feature in the local paper, smiling next to his banker, shaking hands on another deal. He was held up as an example of aggressive, forward-thinking agriculture. Meanwhile, I just kept my head down. I farmed my 320 acres. My yields were good, consistent. With the high grain prices, I was making more money than my father ever had, but I didn't spend it like Dale did. I didn't leverage it. I lived by my father's creed. The bank gives you an umbrella when the sun is shining and asks for it back the minute it starts to rain. Instead of buying more land at inflated prices, I improved what I had. I put in new drainage tile in the low spots on the back 40, paying the contractor in cash. I rebuilt the fences along the creek, sinking new posts myself. I bought a used Gleaner F2 combine, a few years newer than my old one, but I paid for it with a single check from the sale of the previous year's soybeans. It wasn't shiny, but it was mine. To the rest of the county, I looked like a fool. A failure. At the co-op, the talk was always about Dale's latest purchase, his latest expansion. I was an afterthought, the old-timer who was too scared to take a risk. Art Miller's sitting on a gold mine and refusing to dig, I heard one of the younger farmers say one afternoon. By the time he decides to expand, Dale Peterson will own the whole county. Even my banker, a man I'd known for years, called me into his office. He sat me down, offered me a cup of coffee, and laid out a series of charts and graphs. "Art," he said, his voice earnest, "I've run the numbers. With the value of your land right now, you could borrow enough to buy that half section next to you and a whole new line of equipment. You're debt-free, your credit is perfect. You're the ideal candidate. We can have the papers drawn up by Friday." I listened politely, finished my coffee, and stood up. "I appreciate the offer, Tom," I said, "but I'm happy with what I've got. I like sleeping at night." He looked at me with the same pity I saw in Dale's eyes. "You're missing the opportunity of a lifetime, Art. This boom isn't going to last forever." On that last point, he was more right than he knew. I felt the pressure, of course. It's hard not to when you see your neighbor's operation expanding like a thunderhead on a hot July day while you're still running the same ground. There were nights I'd lay awake, wondering if I was making a colossal mistake. Was I just stubborn? Was I letting my father's Depression-era fears hold me back from a prosperous future? Then I'd go out to my shop. I'd run my hand over the cool steel of the 40/20's fender. I'd smell the familiar scent of grease and diesel. I'd look at my tools hanging neatly on the pegboard, each one paid for. And I'd remember the quiet satisfaction of bringing a machine back to life with my own hands. I didn't owe anyone for this. This was real. It was mine. The fall of 1977 was a good one. The weather held, and I got my crops out in good time. Dale, with his massive fleet, was done a full week before me, of course. He threw a big harvest party, a pig roast with half the county in attendance. I was invited, but I didn't go. I spent that evening in my shop, changing the oil on the 40/20, getting it ready for winter. As I worked, the radio on the workbench was playing softly. A news report came on. The announcer's voice was grim. He talked about inflation, about interest rates starting to creep up. He mentioned the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, a man named Paul Volcker, who was talking about wringing inflation out of the economy. They were just words on the radio, distant and abstract, but they sent a cold shiver down my spine. I finished my work, wiped my hands on a red rag, and shut off the shop light. Standing in the darkness of my farmyard, I could see the bright lights of Dale's party blazing across the fields. I could hear the faint sound of music and laughter carrying on the cold night air. It looked like the top of the world over there. But as I looked up at the vast star-filled sky, I saw the first thin wisps of clouds moving in from the northwest. A change in the weather was coming, a big one. And I had a feeling it wasn't just the sky that was about to turn. The winter of 1978 started with an unnerving mildness. We had an open December, the ground frozen hard but bare under a pale, indifferent sun. The old-timers at the co-op said it was a bad sign, that nature was just taking a deep breath before it hit us with everything it had. They were right. The storm began on a Wednesday afternoon in January, not as a gentle flurry, but as an assault. The sky turned the color of a fresh bruise, and the wind came screaming out of the northwest, carrying with it a fine, stinging dust of snow that scoured the paint off the barn. By nightfall, the world outside my windows had vanished into a howling vortex of white. The radio announcer's voice, crackling with static, called it a blizzard of historic proportions. He wasn't exaggerating. The wind gauge at the Waterloo airport had clocked gusts over 70 miles an hour before the power went out. The temperature plummeted to 20 below zero, and with the wind, they said it felt like 80 below. It was a cold that didn't just bite, it consumed. A cold that could freeze diesel fuel in the lines and turn engine oil into tar. I spent the first day keeping the fire stoked in the wood stove and checking on my small herd of cattle in the barn. The snow was already drifting higher than the fences. On the second morning, the wind had died down some, but the silence was just as menacing. The world was buried. My lane was gone, replaced by a 10-foot drift that curled over the top of my pickup truck. The cattle needed feed and water, and the tank heater had quit when the power died. I pulled on my insulated overalls, layered 2 coats, and wrapped a scarf around my face until only my eyes were showing. The air in the machine shed was so cold it felt like breathing microscopic needles of glass. I stood before the 4020. This would be the test. Dale Peterson, with his climate-controlled cab and push-button everything, was probably sitting warm in his house, waiting for the county plows that wouldn't come for days. His fancy new machines, with their sensitive turbochargers and complex hydraulic systems, were notoriously hard-starting in the bitter cold without a block heater. And his power was out just like mine. My 4020 had no block heater. It had something better, simplicity. I checked the fuel. I'd had the foresight to fill it with winter-grade diesel. I pulled out a small aerosol can from my toolbox. Ether, starting fluid, the old farmer's friend and a young engine's enemy if you use too much. I gave a quick 1-second spray into the air intake, just a little sniff to wake it up. Then I climbed onto the cold iron seat, pulled the fuel shutoff and hit the starter. The 24-volt system spun the big 6-cylinder engine with a deep groaning protest. Rrrr! It was slow, fighting against the gelatinous oil. I waited a moment, letting the batteries recover, then hit it again. Rrrr! A puff of white smoke coughed from the exhaust stack. I gave it another try, feeding a little throttle this time. Rrrr! Rah, chug, chug. It caught, sputtered, and then with a great shuddering roar, the John Deere diesel engine bellowed to life, the sound echoing in the frozen stillness of the shed. The cloud of smoke was thick and white, but it was the most beautiful sight in the world. It was the sound of survival. I let it warm up for a good 20 minutes, the engine's rhythm smoothing out as the heat began to creep through its iron veins. I hooked up my old Freeman loader, put a bale spear on it, and pushed my way out of the shed. The tractor fought for every foot, the rear wheels digging and spinning, the loader bucket clearing a path through drifts that were chest-high. It took me an hour to clear a path to the barn and get a round bale out to the cattle. They were huddled together, their backs white with frost, their breath pluming in the frigid air. As I was finishing, I saw a figure struggling through the drifts from the direction of Dale's place. It was Dale. He wasn't wearing his usual clean seed corn cap and light jacket. He was bundled in old hunting clothes, his face red and raw from the wind, a look of desperation in his eyes. He stumbled into the cleared area by my barn, breathing hard. "Art?" he gasped, his voice raspy. "Art, I need help." I idled the 4020 down. "What's wrong, Dale?" "It's my cattle," he said, the words tumbling out. "They're in the lot by the new shed. The drifts are over the tops of the windbreaks. I can't get to them. I've been trying to start the 1586 for 2 days. It won't even turn over. The batteries are dead, the fuel's gelled up. It's just dead." He looked at my 4020, running steady, its exhaust a clean, rhythmic puff in the cold. He wasn't looking at an antique anymore. He was looking at a lifeline. "The roof on my new machine shed," he added, his voice cracking. "The weight of the snow. It's starting to buckle. The main truss is groaning." I didn't hesitate. There was no room for smugness or, "I told you so." This was about livestock. This was about neighbors. "All right," I said, "let me get a chain. We'll get a path cleared to your feed bales first." For the rest of that day and all of the next, we worked. Me on my 4020, him on the ground, shoveling where the tractor couldn't reach. We ploughed a path to his hayshed, moved bales to his starving cattle, and used the loader to push tons of snow off the roof of his new machine shed, relieving the pressure just as one of the purlins was beginning to splinter. It was brutal, exhausting work. The old John Deere never faltered. It just kept chugging along, its simple, heavy-duty engineering a defiant roar against the killing cold. By the third evening, the county plough finally broke through on the main road. The crisis was over. Dale stood in my yard, the setting sun turning the endless snowscape pink and orange. He looked tired, beaten. "I don't know how to thank you, Art," he said, his voice quiet, all the old arrogance gone. "You saved my herd. You probably saved my shed." He looked over at the 4020, now parked and cooling, ticking softly in the dusk. "I owe you. For the fuel, for your time." "You don't owe me anything, Dale," I said, cutting him off. "That's what neighbors are for." He nodded slowly, then looked out over the vast frozen fields that separated our farms. "You know," he said almost to himself, "my banker called this morning. Got through on the party line. He wanted to know if I thought I'd have any trouble making my spring payment." He let out a short, bitter laugh. In the middle of all this, that's what he's worried about. The blizzard of '78 broke more than just the weather. It broke the spell. For the first time, people in the county saw the fragility of the new way. They saw that a $500,000 line of financed equipment was useless if it couldn't start when you needed it most. It was the first crack in the foundation, and the earthquake was just around the corner. The thaw that followed the blizzard seemed to signal a return to normal, but it was a deceptive spring. The real storm was brewing in boardrooms and government offices far from Iowa. The words I'd heard on the radio, VUCA, inflation, interest rates, began to take on a terrifying, concrete meaning. The prime rate, the number that banks based their own loans on, started to climb. 8%, 12, 15. By 1980, it was clawing its way toward 21%. At the same time, the other shoe dropped. In response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, President Carter declared an embargo on grain sales to the USSR. Just like that, our biggest customer was gone. The bottom fell out of the market. Corn that had been selling for over $3 a bushel plummeted to under $2. Land that had been feverishly bid up to $3,000 or $4,000 an acre was suddenly worth less than $1,000, and there were no buyers. The math simply stopped working. Dale Peterson was trapped. He had variable rate loans. That spring operating note he'd taken out at 9% was suddenly costing him 18. The payments on his 1586 and his 7720 combine, which had seemed manageable when corn was high, were now impossible. The value of his land, the collateral for all his debt, had evaporated. The bank that had once courted him, that had called him a visionary, now saw him as a liability. The change in the coffee shop was palpable. The confident talk of expansion and leverage was replaced by hushed, worried conversations about foreclosure notices and loan officers who wouldn't return phone calls. Farmers who had once bragged about their new four-wheel drive tractors were now quietly asking around for parts to keep their old ones running. The dealership that had been bustling with activity a few years prior now sat quiet, its lot full of unsold inventory. I saw Dale at the co-op one day that fall. He looked like a ghost. He'd lost weight, his eyes were sunken, and he moved with the slow, defeated shuffle of a man carrying an invisible, crushing weight. He was buying a single hydraulic hose, and I saw him flinch when the parts man told him the price. He paid with a crumpled check from a nearly empty checkbook. We nodded to each other, but the easy camaraderie we'd found working together in the blizzard was gone, replaced by a thick, uncomfortable silence. He knew his situation, and he knew that I knew. Everyone knew. My own situation was starkly different. The low prices hurt, no question. My income was cut by nearly half, but my costs were a fraction of Dale's. My land was paid for, my equipment was paid for, my biggest expenses were fuel, seed, and fertilizer. I didn't have a single bank payment to make. When the hydraulic pump on my old Gleaner combine went out mid-harvest, I didn't have to beg a banker for a loan to fix it. I drove to a salvage yard, bought a used one, and spent a long night under the machine with a set of wrenches and a trouble light, getting it running myself. I was making a living, not a killing, but I was surviving. I was sleeping at night. The end for Dale came the following spring. A small, unassuming notice appeared in the legal section of the county newspaper, a sheriff's sale. It listed in cold black and white type the legal description of Dale Peterson's farm. The entire operation, the land, the buildings, the equipment, everything. The bank had called his notes. The dream was officially dead. The day of Dale's auction was a grey, overcast day in March, almost 10 years to the day after that Henderson sale where he had mocked my old-fashioned ways. The mood was funereal. There was no excitement, no eager bidding. Just a quiet, somber crowd of farmers, their faces etched with worry, all of them thinking the same thing. There, but for the grace of God, go I. The auctioneer started with the small items, the tools, the shop equipment. Things sold for pennies on the dollar. Men who had once been Dale's friends averted their eyes, ashamed to be picking over the bones of his failed enterprise. I saw Dale standing near the back of his new machine shed, the one I had helped him save, his wife beside him, her arm linked through his. He looked hollowed out, a man who had aged 20 years in two. They brought out the equipment next. The gleaming International 1586, the massive 787-20 combine. They were symbols of the boom, monuments to a prosperity that had turned out to be a mirage. They sold for less than half of what Dale still owed on them. I watched the banker, Tom, the same man who had tried to talk me into leveraging my own farm, jotting down the losing numbers in a notebook. His face a mask of grim professionalism. The umbrella was being called back in the middle of a downpour. Finally, they came to the land. They were selling it in parcels. The home 80 with the house and buildings. The quarter section to the north. And then the last piece, the original section his father had owned, the one that bordered my west fence line. The auctioneer started the bidding. The silence was heavy. No one wanted to be the one to take a neighbor's home place. The bidding was sluggish, weak. It stalled at a price that was a fraction of what it had been valued at just a few years before. I had come to the sale with a cashier's check in my pocket. I had done the math 100 times. I had the money, saved up from the good years, tucked away in savings bonds and certificates of deposit, not sunk into new iron. I could buy that section. I could double my farm size in a single day, vindicated, the ultimate winner in our long, silent rivalry. But as I looked at Dale, at the utter devastation on his face, the triumph I expected to feel wasn't there. All I felt was a profound sadness. I saw a man who had believed the experts, who had chased a dream sold to him by bankers and magazines, and who was now paying the ultimate price. I let the bidding on his father's section close, selling to an out-of-state insurance company for a shamefully low price. Then, instead of raising a hand to bid on the next parcel, I walked away from the crowd, around the back of the barn, and found Dale. He looked up as I approached, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and exhaustion. "Art," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Dale," I began, choosing my words carefully. "I'm sorry for all this." He just shook his head, unable to speak. "I talked to Tom at the bank last week," I said, "and I talked to the man from the insurance company who just bought your dad's old place. They're just looking for an investment. They don't want to farm it. They want a tenant." Dale looked at me, confusion clouding his features. "I made them an offer," I continued. "I'm going to rent that section from them, the one that borders me, and I need someone to run it, someone who knows that ground better than anyone." I paused, letting it sink in. "I'll provide the equipment, my equipment. We'll split the input costs. You'll take the majority share of the profits. It'll be enough to keep you in your house, to give you a chance to get back on your feet." Tears welled up in his eyes. He tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come. He just stood there, a broken man being offered not a handout, but a hand up. A chance to keep doing the only thing he knew how to do, on the land his father had farmed before him. It wasn't a victory speech. It was a quiet treaty, signed in the shadow of a barn, far from the auctioneer's callous chant. The years that followed were lean, but they were good. Dale and I farmed that section together for over a decade. The partnership was a quiet one. We didn't talk much about the past. We talked about the weather, about crop conditions, about fixing the clutch on the old Gleaner combine. He was a good farmer, a hard worker, once you stripped away the hubris of the boom years. He learned to fix things himself because he had to. He learned the rhythms of my old 4020, the feel of its worn levers, the sound of its honest, simple engine. In a way, he learned to farm all over again. The community changed too. The survivors of the farm crisis were a different breed. They were humbler, more cautious. The coffee shop talk turned from new equipment to repair tips. My shop became a regular stopping place for neighbors with a broken part or a mechanical puzzle they couldn't solve. I never charged them anything. I just helped them figure it out, share what I knew. The man they once called a dinosaur was now respected, his wisdom sought after. My son John grew up during those hard years. He didn't see the glamour of the boom times, he saw the reality of survival. He spent his childhood in my shop, learning how to turn a wrench, how to weld a bead, how to listen to an engine and understand what it was telling him. He learned the value of a paid-for machine and the peace of mind that comes from owing no man anything. One cool evening in the late 80s, long after Dale had saved enough to buy back his own small acreage and farm for himself again, I was out in the shop with John. He was a young man then, tall and strong, his hands already showing the calluses of a farmer. We were doing an overhaul on the 4020's engine, giving the old soldier a new set of rings and bearings. He was carefully cleaning a piston, wiping away years of carbon and oil. He looked up at me, his expression serious. "Dad," he asked, "were you ever tempted? Back in the 70s, when everyone was getting rich. Weren't you scared you were getting left behind?" I stopped what I was doing and looked at the tractor, its iron guts laid bare on the workbench. I thought of Dale's face at the auction, of the smug look he'd given me all those years ago, and of the quiet dignity he'd found in starting over. "Scared?" I said, running a hand over the tractor's faded green hood. "Every single day. But I was more scared of handing the keys to my life over to a man in a suit who didn't know the difference between a cultivator and a combine. This," I said, tapping the solid engine block, "this is real. You can understand it. You can fix it. You can depend on it. And as long as you own it, and it doesn't own you, you'll always be free." He nodded, a deep understanding passing between us without any more words. He went back to his work, his hands moving with a confidence that made my heart swell with pride. The legacy wasn't the 320 acres of black Iowa dirt. It was this knowledge, this independence, this quiet strength. It was the wisdom to know the difference between a gamble and an investment, and to understand that the best thing a man can build is a life he controls himself. The old tractor sat there between us, silent and patient, its engine waiting to be reborn, ready to teach the same lessons to yet another generation.